you would be just insane to say you're drafting, Will Anderson over Bryce Young or Tyree Wilson over Bryce Young. Even if you think for their respective positions, maybe they're better players, you need the most valuable one. So you're falling behind if you're not making those same decisions, right? If you're looking at the first round and not baking in how much money you're saving against the cap if this guy turns into a good player.
Welcome to Unexpected Points. I am your host, Kevin Cole. Thank you for joining me. I have Mike Renner, draft guru extraordinaire from PFF on here for the podcast. We're going to go through, of course, positional value, his thoughts on that, how he incorporates that into his draft process. I think doing a better job than pretty much anyone else out there right now. And we discuss a few different positions. We do our little bit of running back talk, of course, with Bijan. We talk about tight ends quite a bit, and I think tight ends are one of the most interesting positions when we think about positional value, second contracts, where to draft them, and this class has a lot to offer as far as that's concerned. Of course, we get into quarterbacks. He, like me, is more of a Bryce Young guy, but we want to get into the arguments around Anthony Richardson, how to think about him, whether accuracy can be fixed, if you should bet on those sorts of trades. We have all of that discussion there. And then we get into some, talk about what I call the draft industrial complex generally, which is how do you get engagement? How do you get people engaged in your work and excited about your work without being overconfident? How does groupthink come into play? Are we going to see that with Anthony Richardson on the high side now versus what we saw maybe on the low side with Justin Herbert in the past, and how he thinks about building together everything that he puts into place and how he receives and incorporates feedback from the market, from other opinions out there, and what he's doing. So great episode here. I think it's going to be extremely helpful for anyone thinking about this draft and how they should view draft rankings, evaluations, all that stuff overall, big boards, all of it. Follow Mike on Twitter at PFF_Mike. Again, I have a subscription to PFF still, former PFF guy. Love to get a hold of the draft guide and everything that he's doing there. If you are new to the podcast, go ahead, subscribe, do all that stuff here. You can find these also on YouTube. And if you want to get hold of my research, a lot of stuff I look at are type of topics that we discuss. As if I go into more detail with some visualizations on the Substack, it's unexpectedpoints.substack.com. You can find all of my research there. All right, enough of me, rambling on over here. Let's get to Mike Renner discussing everything 2023 NFL Draft.
All right, Mike, welcome to the podcast. Former colleague, former teammate, I guess if we want to go that far at PFF. So thank you for joining me. I'm glad to have you on here. And we talked about it slightly beforehand because I'm going to have some questions around maybe some critiques, poking some holes perhaps in a lot of what I see out there in the draft world. But I know that you're thinking critically about a lot of this stuff that's going on here. So you're the perfect guy to help me out on this journey here. Are you ready?
Yeah, I like getting critiques. Now, I don't like tweeting something out and then someone just saying you don't know what you're talking about. I like people like challenging my beliefs of the draft and whatnot, because like that's how I approach the draft. Is I'm challenging, what NFL teams are doing. It is kind of like how I position myself. So someone challenging that and challenging me, I'm more than happy to have that discussion.
Well, I think it'll be like half challenge, half, backslapping about how your process differs maybe than some others out there and why I agree with it a bit more when it comes to, big boards and rankings and all this sort of stuff. Positional value, of course, is the big thing everyone's going to be talking about in there. We'll get into all that stuff. We'll get into some prospect stuff. I think mostly for quarterbacks because I'm interested in not only your take on these particular quarterbacks, and I've seen your rankings on there, so obviously I kind of know where you're coming from on there, but also some other ideas that are floating out there. An article, I don't know if you had a chance to read by your colleague, Timo Risquet there about Richardson. I think Sam also wrote something recently about maybe going Anthony Richardson number one, what he would do. So we'll get into some of the theory behind that because I have some takes in that area also. But let's start big picture here. And when you are approaching the whole process of going into ranking these different players, and I'm going to talk about ranking them in a big board style, because a lot of the big boards and the critique that I have of them is that there's a grading process, which may or may not, it seems like it mostly doesn't account for positional value. and then the big board is placed or the rankings are placed, and it's just rank ordered guys based upon grading. And then when it comes to how positional value fits into that, either the draft evaluators don't really believe in it that much, or it's like you figure it out yourself. So how is your process differing from that, and how is it similar to that?
Yeah, it definitely. I'm definitely taking in positional value when it comes to the draft board. To me, it should look like, if I'm building a team, who am I like literally taking? And if you have zero, so you have zero players at any positions, and if you have zero players at any positions, and you're in a class like this with the quarterbacks that they are, you would be just insane to say you're drafting, Will Anderson over Bryce Young or Tyree Wilson over Bryce Young. Even if you think for their respective positions, maybe they're better players, you need the most valuable one. So I do think that is kind of how I'm basing it off of. And in the draft conversation, you're falling behind if you're not making those same decisions, right? If you're looking at the first round and not baking in how much money you're saving against the cap if this guy turns into a good player for me, that I don't have to pay to that position in free agency to get an impact or wherever it may be. So that's how I'm looking at the board. I don't have a hard, fast science to it, I'll say, in terms of where. It's more just like I make those decisions in my head of like, hey, this guy, I see him as a very good guard, but I see this guy as possibly a very, a slightly above average tackle. Well, I'll take the slightly above average tackle because that has way more value. So like, that's kind of how I'm making those decisions when I'm ranking the guys. But I do think there is still value, or is still a place to put a number on to know the historical context of how good this guy is. To just put like, Bijan Robinson's 7.2 or whatever, and that's the highest grade you've given to a running back in a decade. I still think that's important and matters, but it shouldn't be what your draft board looks like. It should just be to keep your scouting sort of self in check and make sure you're not overinflating expectations for every prospect that you watch.
Yeah. I mean, one of the confusions that I have is that, whatever, I'll just mention names here. So, for instance, Daniel Jeremiah will come out with his rankings, I believe it's not called a big board, so maybe that's probably just called rankings. And then, whatever, it's Twitter, I'll make some snarky comment about, Bijan Robinson being number 3 on there. And then people will yell at me saying, well, it's rankings, it's not how you would draft them. But then I see other people who will explicitly throw up grades and then tie them directly to like where they should be drafted. So I guess my thing is, I'm just confused. Like, do you think when Daniel Jeremiah says he's the 3rd best player in there, and then he's also followed that up by saying, he's a guy who could go in the top 5, deserves to go in the top 5, top 10. Like, what do you think he means by that? How should I be interpreting it?
I think he himself does not care about what position a guy plays until it gets to like long snapper, kicker, punter, right? Like, that's when it starts to matter. But I don't think he himself cares about where you are in a football field. It's just where you are compared to your historical at your position, which is fine. But when you rank them in that order, it means nothing, right? It's a meaningless sort of exercise then if you're not going to put your money where your mouth is and say he's 3rd on my board, I draft him 3rd overall in this class. Then I think you're doing the public a disservice and really just confusing them to say otherwise. So I just think that's how the draft was done, though, for so many years. Is just you have the grade. That's how you stack it up. But I do think we're getting around to the point where we need to be a little bit more honest with the fans that we're putting these rankings out to.
I mean, in DJ's defense, I don't think he's quite saying as much that he wouldn't take them there as much as other people are jumping in and being like, no, that's not where he would actually take him. And I guess it brings me to another point. And I think we've seen this, like the whole running back discussion we've had as far as how to pay them on second contracts, whether it's when Zeke's deal came up or Christian McCaffrey or Derrick Henry or Dalvin Cook or whoever's coming up along the way. I mean, the NFL has kind of already moved, right? They have already moved to downgrading and devaluing these. It feels like within the media, there's more of a discussion about, Derrick Henry's the most important player on the Titans or something like that, and that's how he should be paid. How much of that are we also seeing on the draft side? Because I talked to Benjamin Robinson recently, who tracks mock drafts, and he's seeing probably for the first time when we have one of these running backs who's really being graded in big board in the top 5, top 10. But the mock drafts are really pushing him down vis-a-vis where the big board is. There's a huge separation there, which we hadn't seen in the past. Is that also maybe more evidence of the fact that the media is saying, well, we know this guy's going to go later, but we still kind of believe he should go earlier?
Yeah, this draft will be a great litmus test for that, right? Because if you just look back, 5 years ago with Saquon going number 2 overall, 3 years ago it was Josh Jacobs, but like those GMs are gone. The teams have saw what happened there to Mike Mayock, saw what happened to Dave Gettleman, saw how those franchises got mismanaged, and said, oh, maybe. And 2 guys who are hits, Saquon and Josh Jacobs lived up to the hype, right? Like they're good running backs in the NFL, and yet it still hasn't mattered. And so I think this draft, especially when it's a really deep class, when there's some guys who, 5 years ago were Bijan's a top 10 pick, and it's not even, no one's even debating it, right? It's hardly getting any airwaves calling him to be so. So I do think you're seeing the movement. How much will it move? It still remains to be seen. Because I don't know, because, Bill Belichick with the 14th pick might pick Bijan, because the Falcons, the run heavy team in the NFL, they might, number 8 overall, might pick Bijan. We just don't know yet. So this class will be a great sort of first wave or first test to how much new NFL GMs and like the new sort of thought process of, a lot of analytically driven GMs that have proliferated around the league, how much they actually do buy into it or how much they don't.
Yeah. I mean, you only need one, right? You only need one to put in that card. So sometimes you don't even know if it's representative of the entire league and how they view things. And there's probably, a little bit more of a gradations between how different teams view different players. Okay, we've done the running back thing. I know, like I'm kind of done with the running back thing. Honestly, I can't do it anymore. I'm just going to say, like, for Bijan, I'm just going to say, whatever. I wouldn't take him in the first round. Okay. But if you want to, you make that argument, that's fine. I just don't think there's anything new. There's no new ground there. I am interested in some of your rankings, though, in some other places. Because I remember, I think before I actually started PFF, I talked with you leading into, which one was TJ Hawkinson? What draft was that?
That was 2019, I believe.
Might have been 2019. So we had Hawkinson and Noah Fant. Both of them went in the first round. Hawkinson, obviously, very early. What was he, 10? No. 8th.
He went 8th.
I was thinking of Eric Ebrod. Eric Ebrod was 10. The Lions, they love those tight ends. So that year, I remember, okay, I look back at your big board rankings. You had Hawkinson at 21 and Fant at 43. This year, you have Dalton Kincaid at 15 and Mayer at 28. I'm not sure where those guys are going to go. It seems like your rankings for these particular players might be closer to what their actual draft positions are versus what we've seen in the past. I believe back then for Hawkinson, I don't know if it was a Hawkinson specific thing about maybe his traits, but you were pretty down on the idea of a first round, especially first half of the first round, tight end and the value you can get there. Has your opinion changed at all about tight ends? Is this prospect specific? I'm interested in your read here.
I think there's so few that are worth it. And Hawkinson, with where he ended up at the big board, I thought he was worth it. Obviously not 8th overall. And I think that's come to somewhat fruition, right? He was a top 3 tight end in receiving, I think, a couple of years ago. Like, he's the type that I think if you did a redraft, he'd go in the first round yet again in that class. So I think that's fair when you are that talented, though. And I think so few guys is the problem. Like, it's just a position where there's not a lot of guys I see making that kind of impact at the next level. This class is an outlier, and that I think it has 2 that I truly think can be dynamic, featured players in an offense. And it comes back to what I always say is, like, if you want, tight ends that move the needle, produce like wide receivers. To produce like a wide receiver, you also have to move like a wide receiver. So you have to be able to get open on your own. It's the big thing that so few tight ends prove in college. Because that's where you separate yourself. That's where Travis Kelce is, because you can run him on option routes. You can run him on stuff over the middle of the field and just know he's getting open if it's 1v1. That is, again, count on one hand right now in the NFL, the amount of guys that are like that. I think Dalton Kincaid is one. I think Michael Mayer is going to be one. And so that's why I have those guys ranked where they are. After that, it's a deep tight end class for sure. But that's kind of, to me, the separator of whether or not I'm willing to invest any sort of high draft capital in that position.
Yeah, I've looked at trying to do these surplus value calculations, and part of it is difficult because there's a small sample of first round tight ends, and let's
Mhm.
say, and they just haven't been that successful over time. I mean, maybe if you go, like I said, Hawkinson's been decently successful as a guy who was drafted number 8. But I mentioned Ebron before. He was someone who went very early. The 2017 draft, it was OJ Howard, Evan Ingram, and David Njoku who went there. Not a whole lot there. I mean, maybe if you go way, way, way back in time, you can find some guys. But even guys like Brandon Pettigrew, Dustin Keller, guys who were in the first round, didn't really do that great. Maybe Vernon Davis, I guess, who was one of the top ones ever drafted before Kyle Pitts. He looks pretty good. But how much of this is just like circumstance that these first round guys haven't worked out versus, I mean, if you would have drafted Travis Kelce in the first round or George Kittle in the first round instead of so much later, it would have been fine, right?
I do think I don't think it's circumstance. I think there is almost, I don't want to say a problem with how the NFL evaluates tight ends, but I just think it's different in what necessarily wins at that position is not what the evaluators start to covet. When you got guys like Hayden Hurst going in the first round, I just think you have a misallocation or just a misappropriation of where the value actually is at the position, and the value isn't like all around ability, right? Just because the guy's well rounded at tight end, I think that's pushes guys up boards too often. It's true dynamism that's valuable at that position. It's the ability to make something happen after the catch. It's the ability to get open on your own. Those are two things that, again, so few guys at that position have. And people want to draft OJ Howard because he's fast and he can block. And it's like, well, can he run a route? We never saw that on his tape at Alabama.
Yeah.
So, and obviously never saw that in the NFL either. So that's the biggest thing with me, is that I just think they kind of, how tight ends are scouted right now, they just overvalue things that don't end up being impactful on a football field.
Another thing that I've always thought about with tight ends, and again, you have this thing where finding the right one seems to have been difficult, or like you're saying, they're using some of the wrong evaluation to find the right one. But yet, if you do find the right one, they can have somewhat of a slow start to their career. I guess for Kelce, it was more injury than necessarily having a slow start to his career. But once you get on that second contract, because of the fact, like you said, you can count on one hand how many guys are truly elite. Well, then you have a franchise tag based upon the top 5 salaries, and whoever's 4 and 5 are not that good. Whoever's 3 and 2 may not have signed a contract in the last 3-4 years. These guys are pretty cheap on their second contracts too. And I feel like they're also maybe a better long-term, like second contract type of player than a lot of positions who are going to shoot up into the mid-20s, high 20s now, $20 million a year for these different non-quarterback positions.
Yeah, and that's the biggest difference between them and running backs, right? Is that they're kind of in a similar pay scale.
Yeah.
On second contracts. They're tight ends that make that much more than running backs.
Yeah,
But
franchise tag is pretty
ends,
similar on them. Yeah.
Yeah. But the tight ends on their second contract get better, right? Like your second contract as a tight end, you are in your prime for 3-4 years at minimum. There's no drop off in that. Whereas running backs, you've already reached your prime. Your prime's year 2, year 3 of your rookie deal. So the investment, first round pick on a tight end, a guy like Dalton Kincaid, you think he's that special. All of a sudden, like you're almost 99% chance if he's producing on his rookie deal, he's going to want to re-sign there because he's obviously getting featured. And then when that's the case, you probably are getting it for cheap because the top of the market's so low comparatively to the actual value they're bringing to the table that guys like George Kittle, guys like Travis Kelce are massive surpluses when they're healthy on the football field on their second contracts compared to, edge, wide receiver, where they get paid how much they're actually worth. Those guys get their numbers inflated a little bit.
Yeah. I definitely think it's always interesting to look at the franchise tag to figure out sometimes where these guys can be values or not. How about wide receiver? I think is also one where even I can't quite figure out, because it seems like there's a lot of guys, especially second round guys. Again, this may be a lot of just circumstance when we talk about Metcalf, AJ Brown, Deebo Samuel, those types who have gone in, T. Higgins, I guess at the beginning of the second round, have gone in the second round, have been pretty good guys. You could all make the case like they should have been drafted earlier, but yet at the same time, it's much harder to find your tackle, your edge, maybe even your pass rushing interior defender in the second round where you can find these wide receivers. So how do you weigh those two things versus each other where receivers, and now receivers have stepped up on the pay scale too recently? Do you want to be taking them, or do you think about the opportunity cost if you're going to pass up on the tackle that you just can't get in the second round?
I think you still want to be taking them. I do think it's an arms race in the NFL, right? Because it is so valuable. Like the reason that their salaries are going up is because people are realizing, hey, if I have, I have a Cooper Kupp, all of a sudden I have like a slot machine. Like I got a guy that I just know can churn me offense, and that's where the NFL is going, is having like 2, 3 of those guys, and so they're not letting these wide receiver ones go hit the open market and go make impacts elsewhere. It's rare to see. So I do think that you've almost swung to the point where the NFL is seeing it on par with kind of how we are last year. Like last year, you went, 8, 10, 11, 12, 16, 18. And guys who at 16 and 18, Jahan Dotson and Traylon Burks, were back in 2019 would have been second rounders, right? Like 2019 draft was after 3 or 4 straight bad drafts of wide receivers. Teams had been like, we just don't know how to scout these guys. Only draft, Hollywood Brown, N'Keal Harry in the first round, Debo, AJ Brown, TK all go in the second, Terry McLaurin in the third. That was to me an overreaction of the previous few years of drafting, and now we've swung back completely the opposite side of the pendulum, where this isn't a great receiver class. I think Jim Nagy tweeted out that he's talked to teams that have 1 first-round grade in this receiver class, but 4 are still going to go because it's just teams have realized that I can't win if I have a receiving core that looks like what the Packers looked like last year, what the Bears looked like. You're just screwed in today's NFL because you need guys that are difference makers there. And so even if the guy profiles to like a number 2 and maybe not a surefire stud even at number 2, I think that's still worth a first-round pick because you're really trying to give as many options as you can to your quarterback. That's what's winning. Guys that can separate is what's winning. And so in this class, I do still think like Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, Quinn Johnston, JSN, like not great prospects, not complete prospects by any means, but it's still like you got to take the chance. You got to swing for those because you can fake pass rush with the blitz. You can't fake guys getting open as much in the NFL nowadays.
Okay, so maybe we can talk about some of the specific names here for receiver, because one of the conversations out there is, like the slot only sort of stuff. You mentioned JSN. He's probably going to be the guy who I think is number 1 in the betting markets, maybe to go first. I know a lot of people still have Addison being a little bit higher, maybe a guy who's works a little bit more down the field, but he's really small too, so he doesn't really fit the prototype sort of role there. And, it can all get simplified. It'll get simplified like, hey, Cooper Kupp's great. He's a slot receiver. So therefore, it doesn't matter if a guy's a slot receiver. And at the same point in time, people are going to compare him to, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's been great, who's been extremely valuable. But he probably went later than he should have, but he went in the 4th round for a reason, maybe, versus some other guys. So there is, again, that opportunity cost sort of things. Where are you sitting in this discussion where we don't have to go to the extremes. We don't have to say it doesn't matter if you're only a slot only guy at all anymore because of these few successes. It probably matters less, but where do you think we are now in this conversation? Is it maybe being underplayed even at this point to say someone like JSN would be number 1, the wide receiver 1, where we probably wouldn't have seen that even a few years ago?
Yeah, I do think there's been a shift in the valuation of slot receivers. And obviously you just look at, like you said, Cooper Kupp's contract, and it's like he's getting paid more than, I think all but 3 non-receivers, non-quarterbacks in the NFL right now.
Yeah.
And that's like, and he's just a slot, and no one's ever debated if he's, outside versus inside. Like that, he just is. But if you're good enough at it, it's still insanely valuable, and more valuable than, again, hitting on a high-end tackle, hitting on a high-end guard, hitting on a high-end running back, hitting on high-end pretty much every other position. So I think that's where the NFL is seeing it. It's like, yeah, maybe it's not as valuable as your pure outside guy. You'd still rather have Devontae Adams, right? But if a guy's a sure thing in that regard, he's still more valuable than the linebacker I could have drafted, the safety I could have drafted. So that's why I have JSN as the top 12 player in this class, and I fully expect him to come off the board in the top 15 this year because of that right there. Is that if you have a role for a slot in your offense, you're not going to do better than a guy like JSN.
Now you do have Quentin Johnson a little bit higher. So I assume that's something where if all else was, if you just ignored the slot sort of considerations, I don't know how you do that, but let's say you're doing that somehow, maybe it wouldn't have that rank ordering. I mean, it's 10 versus 12, so we're not talking about a huge thing here. So I assume he is still getting some sort of boost into his profile because of the fact that he's, 6'3", 6'4", whatever he is, and 210 pounds.
Yeah, and that's just like how the NFL works, right? These guys who are smaller, and this class is chock full of them, look great in college, but there's certain things you just can't do with that guy in the NFL. And especially when you are getting down towards like Zay Flowers, it's like a 6-foot wingspan. That's the amount of guys with 6-foot wingspans really producing at a high level is like Tyreek Hill. And then that's it. Like there's just not a lot at the NFL. Maybe I think Tyler Lockett's around that range too. Like you got to be high end to make an impact there. Whereas just like when you have, so Quinn Johnson's 6'10" wingspan, that just gives you a lot of room for error. And size will definitely matter when cornerbacks get bigger at the NFL level. They're all 190, 195 plus. You're just dealing with a different caliber athlete. So that's why I like Quinn Johnson. Is I think at that size he's insanely explosive. Maybe not the fastest. Obviously, his 40 was great, but like he reminds me a lot of just like a bigger Brandon Ayuk, where Brandon Ayuk wasn't a full tree route runner coming out, but you saw it at times. You saw the ability, and the ability to get open. So, yeah, I just trend more, obviously, still towards the guys who can win on the outside.
Okay, and let's talk again as far as a role is concerned and what it may be worth in today's NFL versus others. I mean, I'm going to use a specific player on here. I'm going to use Jalen Hyatt because you have him at, let's see here, 77 in as far as the big board, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wide receiver 8. It looks like on here, and how much of that is him as a player versus it's just like him, right? So if he was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, he would be the same sort of thing. And how much of it is maybe looking at, the continuing shrinking of depth of target and how defenses are playing and the increasing importance of slot. It's one of those things where it's a pie that everyone gets a piece of. And as you're getting more out of these other directions, maybe someone who's really this vertical ball tracking down the field type of threat primarily just doesn't have as big of a value portion in the NFL.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, is that the game is going away from guys who can just get vertical, right? You have to be dynamic underneath. Like you have to be short area quick. Long speed is great, but everyone's doing everything in their power to stop big plays nowadays. You can run a 4-2, but if the safety is giving you a 15-yard cushion, you're just not going to get past them, right? If you got that with NFL safeties nowadays. So I do think speed is not necessarily that high end of a commodity anymore. Like you can go out and sign Marquise Goodwin if you want, right? You can go out and sign guys like Brashad Perriman who have elite speed to be that threat in your offense. Because I do think you still need that somewhere. Like I think the Eagles wide receiving core does work the way it does because Quez Watkins, if you sleep and you fall asleep on him, all of a sudden he's past you, and you have your slot there that can be a big play guy too. So I do think speed still is impactful, but it doesn't bring you to the table. It doesn't bring you 100 catches and 1,500 yards. You have to be a complete wide receiver to do so. And so just having elite speed is fine. It's cool. Nice trait to have. But I think it's just a miss if he does go, first round in this draft class. It's just kind of misidentifying what's winning at the NFL today.
Help me out with something here, because this is always thinking in my head. If I see someone who's pretty good at winning down the field in college, if they test well enough, and then you sometimes see guys in the NFL who are able to also win down the field, who may look similar profile wise. Like, what is it that really gets that guy to win in the NFL? I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about someone like Tyreek Hill. He has freakish speed, but there's something more than that, because even on the Dolphins, he's getting like wide the F open sometimes down the field. And it's not just the 10th of a second on his 40 that's doing that. Is it because he can do everything? Is it the scheme? What is it about translating that speed to the NFL can allow guys to get open like that?
To me, it's speed control, not just speed. It is how much can you sell slow to fast, basically, like lull someone into I'm not running deep, or I'm running to the corner, I'm running at XYZ spot, and then accelerate. So that's kind of the missing thing, is how much guys can control their speed from going down throttling to up throttling. And that's what gets you by NFL caliber defenders. It is not just I can fire off the line and run a 4.2 flat, and that's going to get me past. No, everyone knows as soon as you stick your head down that you're going deep and that you can't, stop if it's going to take you like 6+ yards to stop if you want to. And then by that time, I'll have reacted. I can get down on it. So that to me is the biggest thing, is just speed control. That doesn't get talked about enough. Everyone gets talked about how fast they are at their top speed, but being able to control it and still adjust adjust your body, adjust what where you're going at that high end of a speed is something that just doesn't get talked about enough. And that is how you get open at the NFL level.
Okay, well then how are you going to figure that out? I mean, I know if we have tracking data for college, maybe that's a pretty good application to use that. But when we're talking about the combine, the flying 20 or whatever, I mean, that doesn't really help because they're not decelerating at any point in that and flipping it around. So how are we figuring that out beyond, the quote, I mean, the eye test, obviously, and looking at it there, but is there a way of trying to figure that out better?
I think 3-cone's as good a drill as you're going to get for that, right? Because that's 10 yards and you're turning and you're doing something different. And if you look at Tyreek Hill's 3-cone, I think he went like 6.57. He's one of the fastest times ever for a wide receiver. So that means he can go slow to fast to slow to fast to slow, because it's like 4 legs of a 3-cone that you kind of have to, again, accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, decelerate. And so a lot of high-end guys who may not have been elite speed guys, but still win down the football field in the NFL, they run good 3-cones because then they know how to, again, it speaks to how they can adjust that speed at a whim. So that to me is, if you're not, high and fast, you better have a good 3-cone. If you are high and fast and you have a bad 3-cone, then I'm worried, because how can you actually, again, control that sort of speed?
All right, let's get into some of the quarterbacks here. Let's just go there first, and then I'll hit you with some questions more about the draft industrial complex and how to position yourself within it. Okay, so we talked about how you're figuring out positional value. It's a little bit of art and science, which it should be, and not just purely science on here. So you have Bryce Young number 1, obviously your QB1. Then you have Levis at 4 and then Stroud at 5. So I'm always interested in how, if we're saying a guy is, again, this is not scientific at all, but I kind of feel like almost anytime you put a guy in the top 5, then I'd say, well, why not just put him 2? If you're going to have him at the top 5 and he's a quarterback, more often than not, you may regret that. I feel like you're regretting not, the Josh Allens who go 7, the Herberts who go 6, the Mahomeses who go 10, the Watsons who go 12 in the NFL draft. More often than not, you're saying why didn't we just take that guy earlier, as opposed to, we had our doubts about him and that's why he fell down.
Yeah, I can see that conversation. And I think it's fair. There's also some, I guess maybe not with Jalen Carter anymore, but some security with when a guy's to the level of prospect as the 2 guys are ahead of him in Jalen Carter and Will Anderson, where it's that's a blue chip, $25+ million a year defensive lineman that you're drafting right there. And it's if I am haggling over, some ceilings here of, does Stroud end up as, Ryan Tannehill at the next level, where he's in the $30 million range and that's what you're paying him? Am I is that worth taking that chance, especially if I'm a team that's bad like the Texans and I might be in next year's quarterback class that maybe next year is going to be good? I do think there are still value conversations that have to be had at that point. And it just speaks to me about how good I feel about Jalen Carter and Will Anderson as prospects. I don't think if those guys didn't exist in this draft class, and if it was just Aiden Hutchinson, who I think is just a little bit below those guys, well, then, yeah, I'd probably have QBs 1, 2, 3 in this class. That's just how I see this class. But I think those guys are that level of good that, with as many quarterbacks as there are around the NFL today, in terms of the availability of talent, I might lean towards getting a blue chip player at a high impact position that I
Yeah.
feel very safe about. Is just how I'm when I'm sorting that board right now. Why I feel the way I do about Young versus those other three.
No, that makes sense. I first of all, props for the Tannehill comp. Not that it's right, like I agree with it, but for saying someone comps to Tannehill and they're number 5 on your board, like you would just never see that anywhere, despite the fact that it's a reasonable thing to say. I mean, without mentioning who, I know I've seen Tannehill multiple times comped to quarterbacks, and then they'll say they're a second round prospect. It's like, if you get Ryan Tannehill, like that's a first round pick easily. I'm sorry to say, I know no one's like necessarily hot and bothered over Ryan Tannehill, but like, let's be realistic. We don't need second round prospects to comp to 10-year NFL starters as a good suggestion.
Yeah, who's making more than he's making more than every other non-quarterback in the NFL. So
yeah.
So then you draft that guy in the range that makes more than every other non-quarterback, right?
Yeah. I guess if we're ranking them by how much their fan base is hates them when they're making too much money, then maybe that's part of that conversation there. Okay, let's talk about Richardson then, because you have so Stroud you obviously don't see as being on the same level as Young. So Young is just like a different tier basically for you.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and what determines that tier? I guess if you look statistically, not totally different from Stroud. I mean, what I've found is he's a lot better under pressure, despite the fact I think Stroud has gotten this reputation for being good out of structure because of the one game against Georgia where he played really well. So maybe that's something I would point to. Everyone talks about the size, things like that. Like, how are you mulling maybe these two guys versus each other? Even though I know you have Levis in between them, but maybe we'll just talk about these two, since these are the two that everyone's talking about who will go number 1.
Yeah, so I think to reach, that caliber of quarterback, that there's so few that you are to even join, the elite in the NFL, you have to be an outlier some way, shape, or form. You can't just be like good at a lot of things. Good at a lot of things gets you into the Kirk Cousins tier, right? Like that good at a lot of things gets you into that firmly 8 to 12 in the NFL. You have to have some special traits, right? And so that's, to me, what Young has in this draft class is the special playmaking, creation ability, the ability to see things happen so quickly and make decisions with the football so quickly, and go back to plays like, the sideways pitch he made. Who was that against last year? Just like outside of structure plays that just he's not even thinking. He's just so in the moment and so like advanced and so comfortable that they just come out of him. He just makes those plays, and that to me is an ability that is, again, he's elite at it. And that's a trump card that can get you into that elite tier in the NFL. Do I see that from CJ Stroud? What's his like trait that's going to get him to that level? Accuracy is like close. I don't think he's special like that. There are missed throws on his tape more than probably I would like for a guy who that's his, go-to trait. But he's very good. So I see him ending up in, again, like why I've comped him, Ryan Tannehill. Like that's kind of who you're getting. He just doesn't have anything that's special or elite about him. And again, to get to that tier, you better have Joe Burrow's accuracy. You better have Josh Allen's tools. You better have Justin Herbert's arm. You better have Patrick Mahomes' everything. So like to get to that level, again, we're haggling over a lot of elite prospects over the last, decade or so. So that's how I feel about Stroud. I think of those guys, obviously Richardson has those things, or the easiest to see him on his tape of like, oh, wow, no one that big should be moving that fast and that explosive and have that big of an arm, that it's easy to see those high end plays. It's just, they're not even close to down at this point. And that's like, can you coach a guy to be down to down consistent? That's the biggest conundrum in scouting world that we're all trying to figure out. But you at least see it with him. With Levis, again, you have a special arm. You have special toughness, in my opinion, and what he brings to the table. And that's why I have him above Stroud, above Richardson, is that I think the rigors of playing quarterback in the NFL, which is you're under pressure a lot more. Things are a lot murkier. You gotta, you're going to feel like you're drowning a lot at the NFL level and have to not make mistakes with the football. Well, I think he did that. He's just inaccurate. He just misses way more throws than you'd like. And can it be fixed? we've seen, I think, with the influx of QB gurus and like actual research being done on throwing mechanics, I think we've seen guys improve accuracy more so in the last decade than ever before. But I don't think it's still a big concern that I really just I wouldn't bet on any of those three guys being stud franchise QBs the next level is why I kind of have that tier, whereas I would with Bryce Young.
Okay, so the argument that I've seen out there, and again, it was articulated probably in most detail by Timo Risquet over at PFF, talking about Anthony Richardson, the case for Richardson, but it's really like an archetype sort of discussion instead of a specific prospect discussion. And it's built off of looking at drafts that have happened over basically the last dozen years and saying, does any quarterback who became one of these really special young, quarterbacks that people are just writing blank checks to at this point to want to sign, do any of them not have either an elite arm talent, however you define that, or arm strength also in there, elite athleticism, either or a combination thereof versus that? And he points to Joe Burrow as being kind of the outlier as far as that's concerned. Yeah, Burrow has some athleticism, but I think he ran like a 4.9 or something like that. Like he's willing to do it. He's good at it. He has good feet, but I don't think anyone would call him an elite athlete, and he doesn't have the elite arm talent there. So his point in this piece was that like so many things have to go right if you don't have those things to be able to match these other quarterbacks if not everything is right. Therefore, use that kind of like overarching range of outcomes type of idea and just pick Richardson, even if you believe that he's not as good necessarily at this point, at least.
So I think one that's doing like a disservice to just Levis's tools to Bryce Young's tools. Like I would put Young as an athlete to me is like he could play slot receiver in the NFL. I know he shows up 204 at the combine. Like when he was actually on the football field in the 190s, he can turn, like he can avoid contact extremely well when he wants to. So I would put that like an elite trait. But I do agree that, and that's kind of what I went back to about what's the elite trait. To join the elite, what's your elite trait that you have? Joe Burrow, it's accuracy, obviously. Even like Tua, it's anticipation that he does absurdly well to his detriment at times. But like no one throws anticipatory throws quite the way Tua does, and he has to with that arm. But there is something that you need to do elite to be there. But and again, like I said, in this class, I see Young have an elite trait. I see Levis have an elite arm. And obviously his size and his build would qualify as such too. So when you get into that tier of, tools that are uncommon already, I think then you revert back to what they're actually doing on a football field. Like you're not just because he has more elite traits than other people doesn't mean necessarily he's going to get to that level. It's like Cam Newton was the most physically gifted quarterback probably of the last decade. Did he ever become, the best quarterback for a sustained period of time? He got what, an MVP in there. So I guess he kind of did, but like you didn't see it over the whole span of the last decade. No one's putting him on an all-decade team. So I think that's kind of where I'm at with Richardson, is that I'm willing to put him in that conversation purely because of that. But I don't think that I'm willing to throw out on-field performance purely just to chase traits only, kind of like what the Jags did last year with Trayvon Walker versus Aiden Hutchinson. I think Hutchinson was an elite enough athlete in his like ability to turn the corner and be agile at that size that I don't think his ceiling was necessarily tapped. Whereas, they obviously chose to go with Trayvon Walker despite the tape being so far behind what Aiden's was.
Yeah. I think you're right about underselling perhaps the athleticism of someone like Bryce Young. I think it's one of those situations where right now you could make the argument and say, well, Young's not, however you want to define an elite athlete, maybe because of his size and this and that. And then 5 years from now, when Young's a success, you could go like, oh yeah, of course he's an elite athlete, and make the same case that you were making now to eliminate Bryce Young and saying he fell within the parameters of what you needed to be, like just people would have called like Russell Wilson was kind of an elite athlete at the position at a point in time, despite the fact that he was much smaller. And I think he ran like a 4.5 something. He wasn't, he wasn't a blazing speed sort of guy, but he was adding a lot of value on the ground there. So I agree with that. But the accuracy thing, again, this is something that's all over the place. Is it just a Josh Allen thing now? Are we just saying because a quarterback never completed 60% of his passes? I don't think he even completed 50% of his passes when he was at community college before going to Wyoming. Didn't complete 60% of his passes his first 2 years in the NFL. So it's not like he made that transition. Like, what the hell's going on? Like, what is he doing during the summers if it took him until after year 2 to have this happen? Or are we just relying on that a little too much in this accuracy discussion?
Well, I mean, Geno Smith has raised his completion percentage over 10 points from where he was early in his career. I do think, as I said, we know more about throwing mechanics now than ever before, that fixing mechanics, I'm not saying it's easier, but there are tried and true ways of improving accuracy that we know now. Now, does everyone get to that point? Is everyone going to be Joe Burrow, in a decade? No, there's no chance. But I do think that you can at least not, like, there's so few guys that really fail because of wildness at the NFL today. It's like decision making, poise, how they hold up in the pocket, but very few really, just because they can't hit an open target, end up failing in the NFL, in my opinion. So I do think, like I said, to kind of tie a bow on it, I think you can improve it. You can expect a little improvement in accuracy, but is it going to get to the threshold you need to be a successful quarterback is just the biggest thing with Richardson, the biggest thing with Levis at this point.
You know what's interesting, though, is like even Geno. Okay, I'm going to look back here. Do you know he completed 71.2% of his passes in his final college season? It's one of those things where, I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on there as far as on the shorter end.
To Tavon.
Yeah, exactly. But, he was okay before that, 65, 64, 65 in their sort of range. So I think when I looked at this, and I looked at a bunch of different categories, and it seemed like between 0 and 9 yards there was something there that was transferable, but I don't know if that's because it's an actual skill or if just because there's so much noise built into the other types of passes, right? Like talking about a yards per attempt sort of thing, or even a completion percentage. You have a few contested catches that end up being made. You have a few better receivers who can get separations. Receivers are probably more important for those longer passes than they are for the shorter passes. Things like that, behind the line of scrimmage, that's all based upon whatever the scheme may be and things like that. But so those shorter passes seem to matter a bit there. And that's where Richardson seemed to really have a lot of problems and a lot of issues. And like Allen wasn't good at those sorts of passes, but he was still a lot better than Richardson was. And the only guy that I found to be similar as far as his relative completion percentage on those shorter passes was RIP Christian Hackenberg, who was in there. Not saying he's Hackenberg. Okay, whatever. It's a flaming sort of thing in there. So that's another thing that I wonder about sometimes, because I think even Timo in his argument for Richardson, he said, look at how these other players had improved in this 10 to 19 sort of range based upon the scheme and the receivers. And I think I agree that can happen. I'm a little bit less confident that you can get a lot better in that shorter range necessarily, even with better players around you.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to make kind of the excuse that, he didn't even want to target there. And it's like, well, it didn't behoove him to because he was missing a lot of them, right? Like, I wouldn't target underneath either if I was gonna only hit 2/3 of the open guys in that range, just because they're less valuable targets to begin with. So I am worried about his accuracy. People saying like his accuracy is not an issue, I think are just they're a little short-sighted, or just like focusing a little too much on what he's capable of and not just the consistency aspect, which is like literally what accuracy is. So I just don't think you're ever going to find that guy being accurate in that regard. But it's like, does the other stuff make up for it? And with Richardson, when the other stuff's as like insane as it is, it makes it a lot easier to kind of be like, do we need to throw short passes when I can just run this guy like a Bijan Robinson in my backfield? I think that's the conversation that teams are having more so than, is this actually going to get fixed?
Yeah. I think it's also difficult because you'll watch, like I've seen some stuff, the clips, the cut-ups, right? The cut-ups to show his accuracy. And they're normally showing passes that go further down the field. Because let's face it, like, who wants to watch someone throw a little, 5-yard dink and dunk sort of situation? So you're going to see that a bit more. And I think maybe that kind of skews some of the talk on Richardson. So like maybe I'll parlay this into some of the larger discussion about like doing this sort of draft evaluation business. We're seeing, I don't want to go as far as to say like it's really reached kind of groupthink-ish on Richardson, but I think we're getting there a little bit in that sort of way. How do you think about taking in information from what other analysts are saying, taking in information from what you believe the NFL may be doing and, represented through mock drafts, things like that? Do you want to incorporate that into your evaluation? Do you want to make your evaluation have a like built into it kind of a wisdom of crowds type of-ness to it? Or do you want to try to block that out as much as possible and think the value in what you're providing is a truly independent opinion?
I want my opinion when I first watch it to be kind of like just like unfettered by anything else. If you want a blank slate to see what you see, right? I don't want to be impacted as I'm watching the first tape, right? But I do want, after I come to the whatever conclusion it is on a prospect, I want to basically hear the explanation of whoever's highest on him out there. If someone's saying Richardson 1 overall, I want to hear that explanation. If someone says Richardson's a 4th rounder, I want to hear that explanation too, because I want to see both sides of the coin to really like challenge both, what I thought he could be and what I thought his floor is. So that's how I feel about pretty much every prospect, right? Like that's what I'm out there searching for after I watch the tape. And then if I, there are people whose takes and like explanations I read, and then I'm like, well, I don't agree with that at all. So I'm not even going to like entertain it into my evaluation. And there's some that like legitimately make me think. And then I'm like, let me go watch the tape. Let me go see if that's something that, I agree with more with that in mind while watching it. And then I'll move it up. So I think I use the wisdom of the crowds, which like you'd be stupid not to hear other opinions on players and just be in your own closed box with your draft evals. I use it to basically give me an explanation for why I'm wrong in one way or the other. And whichever narrative appeals to me more based off of what I watched, well, then I may move them up one way or the other. So that's kind of how I use the wisdom of the crowds. But I'm definitely, just because everyone's low on Tanner McKee right now, one of my boys in this class from Stanford, doesn't mean I'm dropping him into the 80s. He's sticking firm there, right in the 30s in the PFF draft board.
Okay, so let's talk about like how do you, when you're saying you're listening to someone a different take and you're saying, okay, I kind of want to incorporate this opinion. What are you hearing? Like, how do you judge the validity or maybe the insight that you're not already having, other than like, oh, this guy's seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? I mean, I do the same thing myself, so I know it's a little bit hard to define. It's kind of like it when you read it or hear it or see it. But what do you think about that? Like who to listen to? Because there are a lot of opinions, and there are two diametrically opposed opinions by two people who, at least on paper, are just as qualified as the other one.
Yeah. I mean, it just appeals back to one, logic, and two, just knowledge of the game, right? If you're giving me reasons
knows ball index.
Yeah. I mean, like truthfully, like it is, right? So like if you can give me like logical reasons why, Anthony Richardson's inaccuracy won't be an issue and will get fixed, and then again, like they're logical and I see the reasoning and the football reasons make sense, shit, I'm sold. Like that's what it. I'm more than willing to change my opinion on things given a valid argument, and so that's what I think it is. It's just looking for arguments one way or the other, then judging their validity based off of my knowledge of football, and then based off of obviously the knowledge of football of the person presenting it and how they presented it.
Okay, so this kind of feeds into the same sort of discussion, the ability to incorporate new information, make adjustments, have maybe some intellectual humility, or not be subject to overconfidence in your evaluation, which I think is kind of like the right way to do things. There's lots of books written on like the best predictors in all different fields, and it's people who have these sorts of traits. But I don't know if any of these traits are good if your incentive is to like be a known person, to, have your takes blow up in one way or another, to like stir the emotions of people who are feeling in one direction or another. If you present to them and you say, well, I think there's a 25% chance that Bryce Young will be QB1, but there's a 22%, like nobody wants to hear that shit, right? Nobody wants to go out there. So how do you think about that? Because I think sometimes we talk about this groupthink moving in different directions, maybe in the opposite way. Maybe for Herbert a bit, it became like everyone hated him. And then even I was like, whoa, maybe I'm way too high on this guy, because I thought that he was going to be the number one pick the year before when he didn't come out. And then it moves in that direction. So but it's more fun to be like, Herbert stinks, and then now say Herbert's the greatest ever, than it is to be like, well, Herbert's not playing well, but he could be great. And now it's like, well, Herbert was playing great, but maybe he's not as good as I thought he was. Like, those are just weak and no one wants to hear them.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a fine line, right? Where it's utilizing the crowd as like a guide and just falling into the crowd yourself. And I do think that if you just use it as a guide, well, then you have your own strong opinions already, right? I've already like watched the tape, like I said first, like I've already created what I think of a guy, and then I put that out there, and maybe it comes out that, like I keep going back to Tanner McKee, my opinion of a guy is the highest. And then I'm out there on the limb and I have a strong take, and all of a sudden I'm the one getting roasted for having them too high. And I'm not going to back down from it. Like, I've not heard anyone give me a valid enough argument to drop them from where I have them on the PFF draft board, So I think it just comes with belief in your own opinion, not to a fault, but just that if I haven't heard anything that I think is valid and a reason to drop them, well, then I'm going to stick in line with where my eyes tell me.
Yeah. Also, group chats. These too many group chats out there with people on them. I think that's leading to part of it. Actually, can I talk about Herbert for a second? Because I even remember. I mean, I was a little bit on the side. I wasn't really too involved in PFF stuff on that. I mean, you were lower on him, at least according to the big board. I don't know how much of that, but I think even PFF was very low on Herbert. I remember the draft grade, I believe, was an F for the Herbert pick, at least right during the draft show that was going on there. It was weird. There was really this like almost complete agreement that Herbert was not good, not even with PFF, but outside of PFF. Yet, like, everyone knew he was going to be in that top 5 pick-ish sort of range from what happened on him. Was there anything to learn from that particular like evaluation in Herbert for other guys going forward, or was he really just displaying things now that were not really hints as to what he could have done before?
I do think there's something to be learned in that. Situation is still, it has to be factored in more than even it does, right? Like if you are, and that's like the Levis argument this year. It's like if you're not working with 3 first-round wide receivers, the way Tua was, the way Stroud was, the way Fields was, the way, a lot of these guys have been, a lot of the top quarterbacks, like you're just not going to ever put up numbers the way they do at the collegiate level. It's impossible to. And especially when you're in an offense that just like doesn't have, one of the top play callers in the college football calling plays for you too. So I think that has to be a bigger factor into it. Herbert to me was still a one-off in terms of my personal opinion on him. And I was lower on him because he was a fucking weird guy. Like there were things on his tape that were just very weird. Like he threw a Hail Mary in a game against Utah, like 10 yards out the back of the end zone one time. He dove for the goal line when they were down 21 points with like 20 seconds remaining in a game and got crunched. Like there were just things that he would do consistently, and like they were almost like Kirk Cousins-y in a way, and like throwing short of the sticks, like checking down on 4th down and things like that. And I think you've seen some of that in the NFL. I mean, there was that like sneak he took on his own as a rookie. There's like the average depth of target thing that's still just part of who he is. Like everyone wanted to blame Joe Lombardi there. We're like,
I'm agreeing with you on that one for sure. I'm agreeing with you on that one for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's some Lombardi, right? But it's like, yeah.
He's kind of just an odd dude in a way. And that worried me more than I probably obviously should have let it worry me. But because I was getting, on one end of the spectrum that can turn into Justin Herbert, where still a weird dude, but like the guy plays football like a robot. other end of the spectrum, you have Mitch Trubisky, who's a bit of a weird dude, and then crumbles and pees down his leg under pressure and stuff. Like so, like there. That was my worry, is that I just saw weird things from Herbert that if I'm drafting a franchise quarterback, you'd almost like they were a little too out there.
Yeah, Herbert is my introvert hero though that he's coming through.
Yeah,
Were they Hard Knocks? They were Hard Knocks, right? Or no? There was something. Yeah, because I remember watching that and I was like, oh my God, this guy exudes like zero swag or like pumping up the team or doing whatever. Like he was like Marcus Mariota. Remember the whole Mariota discussion about whether or not like he could be the guy with who he was, and then Mariota failed. So Herbert is doing it for all of us introverts out there.
Yeah. But that like seriously was like a worry for me. And I obviously, like, in retrospect, I remember having a conversation with Bruce Krakowski, and he's like, yeah, dude, I don't know. Like, I just don't know if he's like a winner, like if this guy wants it. And I was like, I feel the same way. And it obviously hasn't mattered. So,
yeah. Okay. The only thing I'll say is I allow people to switch from their draft opinion to their NFL opinion on guys, but there has to be like a moratorium of at least the first 8-9 weeks of the season before you can go from saying the guy was an awful pick to being like their number one backer and build your whole brand on it. Okay. Can I at least put that into play? Like at least wait a little bit of time on that one. And then I'll feel a lot better there. Okay. So we've gone over a lot of stuff here for all these different guys here. Is there anything like about this particular class, whether it be thematically, the positional value things, other things that you're seeing here, maybe just how you're viewing the class generally, that you think is like an important context and like big picture context going into this draft?
Yeah, I think the two of the strongest positions are running back and tight end. And we've obviously kind of hammered it on it already. But just when there are prospects to the degree of Bijan, prospects to the degree of Dalton Kincaid, who I think are like slam dunks at their respective positions, just where's the NFL value of that? Because if there was a prospect to the caliber of Dalton Kincaid at defensive tackle, he's a top 10 pick. At defensive end, he's a top 10 pick. At wide receiver, they're a top 10 pick. Well, at tight end, where does that leave Dalton Kincaid? At running back, where does that leave Bijan Robinson? So I think that to me is probably the most interesting just thing that I want to look for in this draft class.
All right. Well, I know you got to run here, Mike. So thank you for the time. Like I said, my number one guy out there for all things NFL draft. Check out the big board. Check out the draft guide. Check out everything else here that's available through PFF through Mike. And continued success. And thanks for joining me, man.
No, thanks for having me, Kevin.